not this year.
Not this year.
For anybody who's interested, there is a convention happening, I have to say this, in Edmonton in November called Pure Speculation. This year's theme is going to be steampunk. We have Gail Carriger, who's our main author guest of honor, and she writes some really fun steampunk books. It's sort of a Victorian England that never really happened, but there's vampires and werewolves and all sorts of cool things running around, and they're the good guys. And she's fun. And I understand that she is a very, very engaging guest as well. So it's fun to look it up. And we have some brochures at the on-spec table as well.
We're good?
I think we're good. Okay, everybody, thank you for your patience, and your pals ready to...
That was it? Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I think that the concept of this panel originally came from On Spec, I think. I can't remember now from when we were doing this. I want to thank the organizers of the Expo for allowing us to have this, and it's great to have this, like, an amazing audience. I'm really happy that you came out. And so I guess we'll introduce ourselves first, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we do. I understand the theme of this panel is basically what makes a story work, what sells a story. And because we are talking from the point of view of being editors and writers, we can give you some hints, I guess. My name is Diane Walton. I am the managing editor for On Spec magazine. We're in the dealer area where the heck are we?
R5.
R5, thank you very much. And probably a number of you have come by the table. We've talked with a heck of a lot of people in the last couple of days. And a number of people have been telling us that they're interested in writing. And that's what we're looking for. On Spec is a Canadian magazine, first and foremost. We have published stories from people in other countries over the years, just because we get some really good stories that are submitted to us, but we are primarily Canadian. We're always looking for new writing. And a number of stories that show up in On Spec, it's the author's first time publishing, ever. And in fact, I just spoke with a woman today whose sister has just sold us her first story. And so she's looking forward to being in On Spec, and probably in the next year or so when we do the publication. And so that's where I'm coming from. I've been with On Spec since it started, a long time ago. And I am one of the people that actually helps to select the stories that are coming into us. So I can talk from that point of view, what sells to us a short fiction story. Okay, Dave?
Excuse me. My name is Dave Gross. I'm not officially connected to On Spec. I mostly invite them over for barbecues and show them movies from time to time. But in the past, I've edited magazines from Dragon to Star Wars Insider to Amazing Stories. And although we were privileged to print stories from people like Harlan Ellison and Neil Gaiman and Ben Bova and up-and-comer Patrick Weeks.
Yes.
Not really an up-and-comer anymore. He's pretty established.
He's pretty established now.
Most of the stories that we published over my years at the magazines were from either first-time fiction writers or fairly early fiction writers. So I've got some experience in that arena. Excuse me. Since then, I've done much less editing and much more writing, which is why I was showing off the books earlier.
And hi, I'm Margaret Corellis. I'm publisher and editor at Taiki Books. It's a local sci-fi fantasy publisher here in Calgary, and I was here last year and did a panel. We have a booth here too, 210. And so mostly I'm reading novels in the slush pile, and I do a bit of writing myself, just short stories right now. So that's my perspective is mostly going to be from novels and longer length works than the short stories.
So what we'll do is we'll sort of be mindful of the time that we have here. We would like to be able to have plenty of time to open up to a Q&A at the end of this. I'm sure a lot of you have questions that you want to ask us. So we'll just kind of babble away for a little while until we're ready for the questions. But save up your questions. And if there's something that really strikes you like right this minute, put your hand up, And we will, stop what we're talking about, and we'll certainly address your question. And as long as one of us sees it. Okay. Talking about short stories, we have just finished, okay, when we're reading stories for On Spec, reading the slush pile, we get about a 6-week window where we will take our submissions through electronic means. Everybody emails us their stories now. We used to get these things in paper up until a couple of years ago, and now we take everything through email. And there's a good and bad about that. The good is that it saves on a lot of paper. The bad is that we get a lot of stories, far more than when people actually had to lick stamps and put them on the envelopes and make that moment of walking to the post office or putting it in the mail. Now somebody just has to go send. And the downside to that is when somebody is just saying send, sometimes what they send us isn't exactly ready. There's a lot of stories that we've received that the author hasn't obviously had it read by anybody else. They haven't had, that second pair of eyes that goes through and says, on page 3, your character's eyes are blue, but on page 6, they're brown. Those kinds of things. And sometimes everybody says, well, the editors will fix that. Well, no, the editors don't like to fix that. The editors like to have something that you've actually paid attention to and you've been more cautious with. Because we understand honest mistakes. We don't like careless mistakes. And that's a big difference. I mean, every story that we publish, when we buy a story, we'll put it through a fairly stringent edit process where we will go through and we'll say, hey, that sentence, if you said it a different way, then it would be a bit better. And then we discuss it with the writer and we work that out. We don't have time to do that to bad stories or even mediocre stories. We do that with good stories. And that's the guideline we have. So I guess the question is, what makes it a good story? And I can't give you a really good answer about that. Everybody at On Spec is their own person. We all have our own little likes and dislikes. But I think by and large, we find that certain stories will engage us more than others. And sometimes all it takes is a character that just grabs you. And when I say grabs you, it's grabbing you right here. It's saying, follow what's happening to this character, care about this character. Where is this character going to go? What is this character's problem? What are they doing to face this problem? What changes are happening in their lives to get to where they want to go? And we're doing this in 4,000 words, give or take, So it's not a novel. You don't have time to set things up. You don't have time to have this huge story arc where all these things are happening. You have to let us know on the first page what's happening, who it's happening to, why it's happening, and where it's happening, and why the heck that reader should turn the page to the next one, because that's a big problem. There are a lot of stories that we get in the slush pile where we just don't really want to turn the page. And that's the big challenge for you guys, because your first page in a short story has to tell us a lot more than your first page in a novel might have to do. Your turn.
How about we skip to you?
You skipped to me. Well, and the novels are a little bit different. You do have to write something that's going to make me turn the page too, but you don't have to set up the whole story in the first paragraph because it's longer. You have time to develop things, your story twists and everything. But however, you can't take too long. My biggest, some problems I run into a lot in the slush piles for the novels are people who include too much detail trying to set things up. And so they have paragraphs and paragraphs of description and backstory and history and where they went to high school and what they had for breakfast and a chapter of that before they actually get into story. So it's, we need something in between and details about, well, I walked 5 steps to the door and I buttoned 10 buttons when I got dressed in my plaid green shirt that morning and put on my hat, and then I had oatmeal with brown sugar and milk, and then I got a phone call, and then I had to pack my backpack for school, and then I went down. And that's not exciting either. I mean, you have time to develop your story, but you don't have time to bog it down with too much details. It's a balance that they have to strike. Yeah, Dave's kind of in between us. He's got the short stories and the novels.
That's true. I've written quite a few of both, and I've spent about as much time as an editor as I have as a writer. And I really have only one piece of advice. I mean, there's an awful lot of really good advice, and out in the ether, these women are going to give you some good advice. If you Google Elmore Leonard's Rules for Writing, that should be your Bible right there. Just whatever he tells you to do, just do that. Whenever Neil Gaiman talks about writing, it's usually worth listening to. But none of it, no matter how good the advice is, none of it matters unless you do the one thing that makes you a good writer, and that is write. Put your butt in the chair and write. Some people will tell you you need to do that for 10,000 hours before you become an expert. You might be a prodigy. Maybe it'll take you a couple of 100 hours. But you have to sit down and write. And then when you come back to a panel like this, or you look at 10 rules for writing, or you read a whole book on how to write short fiction or screenplays or novels, it will make 100 times more sense because you've gone through it. You've made the mistakes. You've made the discoveries. Sit down and write. Don't talk about writing. Don't get in a writing group, for God's sake. That's the last thing you should do. Because what you're going to do is you're going to sit around and you're going to tell people about your characters. You might as well be playing D&D, and I love D&D. But don't talk about writing. Write. Sit down and do it.
This question in the front.
Question?
Elmore Leonard. I might have said Leonard Elmore, but it's Elmore Leonard. Elmore. Have you heard of the movie Get Shorty?
Yeah.
That's maybe his most famous work. The best thing that ever came out of his work is the TV show Justified. If you haven't watched Justified, you are half a human being. It's so good, and the writing is so good, and he doesn't do much of it. It's all based on a short story that he wrote, but he's kind of the spiritual guidance, and his son is one of the writers, and all of the writers they're basically his acolytes. They worship him. They love the way he writes, the way that he captures language, and it works on every level. Dialogue, story, character, everything is kicking on that show.
That's the one thing, actually, to bring that into it. When we're looking at a story for On Spec, there's a lot of stories that we get that are, let's see, what can I say? Really, really good plot, really, really crappy characters, or really, really good characters, really lame plot. So what we need to have is a clear balance of everything. And again, we still have to have that whole page-turning element, like what is driving the story? And what for us drives the story is the human nature, the human element of this story. What is it that it's going to tell you by the end about the human condition? And that's a lot to say for 4,000 or 5,000 words, but you'd be really surprised what you can actually say in a very short period of time. How many of you, like, if you're reading short fiction, how many of you actually read short fiction for pleasure? Okay. Give me some authors. Who do you like? Okay, Patricia McKillop. Who else? King for short stories. Okay. Anybody read Ellison, Harlan Ellison?
Oh.
Yes? Okay, good.
We call him Saint Ellison here.
Yes, definitely. Those are the people, read a lot more of the old Hugo Award winning stories, like back in the good old days. Read a lot of the classics of science fiction, short fiction, and there's learning in that, indeed. Who's other good for writers back in those days? Ted Sturgeon was an amazing.
Ted Sturgeon, Robert Sheckley, Isaac
Sheckley.
Asimov.
Exactly. Connie Willis writes some brilliant short stories and novels as well, but her short fiction is really, really good. So, one of the things that you do at the same time, like you're reading all of these, you're reading them for pleasure, but you're also reading them to watch what these people are doing with the words, watch what they're doing with the plots, with the characters, and then don't go out and copy them. You have to find your own voice, and that's a big issue, big problem, big challenge.
We have such a short span. I wonder if we should go to questions.
I think we should almost have to, yeah, because we're going to run out of time pretty soon. So let's go to some questions. We'll go with that. Okay.
I was just wondering, more particular to editing, is there, for submissions, is there a preference between digital and then physical copies?
Well, for us, we're pretty much taking all emailed submissions now. We do get a few paper manuscripts that do come in, mostly from people that are looking at really old guidelines on, websites that, don't update stuff. And we will read them. It just takes longer because we have to then pass the paper around to all of the editors to read. So our preference these days is digital.
Yeah, I accept just digital submissions. Although I will say when I'm editing a nonfiction book, I print that up to do the editing for that. It's easier for me visually to move things around. But other than that, everything's digital. Yes.
Do you guys read everything that comes in, or do you get a lot of it?
I open everything up, and and depending upon how, if it's a really good character that I like and the plot is weak, I'll give it a few chapters to see if it picks up. But usually authors really work for the novels on the first 3 chapters, and that's really polished. And then it's when they get towards the chapter 8, chapter 10, when things kind of start to fall apart and get not as tight. But I do open everything up. I do read everything. But there are some stories I read the first sentence and say nope, and that's that.
When I first started editing, I thought I was going to be super editor. And I read every slush pile submission that came in personally. And I was in the office until 10 or 11 o'clock every night. And I did that for a couple of years, and I realized what stupidity that was. And then I would allow myself to say no on the first page if it was just atrocious, or maybe I'd get halfway through it and I'd realize, no, I was right back on page 3. We're done with this one. And that was the best decision I could have made, because then I was dating and going to movies. It was awesome. And the quality of the magazine did not suffer in the least. Now, it certainly made a few people sad, but on the other hand, you made me sad by making me read that story. So I think we're even.
When we get this last go-around, we got 400 submissions, 400 short story manuscripts emailed to on Spec. What happens with us is that we divide those up into batches of, say, 25, and then depending on which of my editors happen to be working with us at a certain time, because we take breaks and everybody has their own lives. So I'll say, okay, Anne, you take batch 1 to 3, Barb, you take 4 to 6, and so on. So we'll divide them up that way. So each editor reads upwards of, say, 75 to 100 stories, and then out of those stories, they say, okay, this story needs a second set of eyes, needs somebody else to look at it. And then we put those all into a separate folder. That's the folder that everybody reads, and then we get together and discuss them. And that could be like the last go-around. It was something like 83 stories in that folder that we had to sit down last Sunday at this particular time and talk about them for about 5 hours.
I had a question down here in the front, actually.
Okay. This is sort of a writing question. First person versus third person. Is there sort of hints on what to make either of those better?
They do different things. Some people resist first person. It just turns them off. But they're a fairly small minority. But there are great books written in first person that would not work in third person. For example, an awful lot of hard-boiled detective fiction is funneled through the point of view of the detective, and that's perfect for a detective story because that way the reader is guided along the same clues as that person. An awful lot of people like to use unreliable narrators, and if that unreliable narrator is a first-person narrator, it's a much bigger betrayal by the end. I write in various points of view. Some people hate the alternating first-person point of view in these novels, or these 3 novels. But an awful lot of people will also tell me it wouldn't work if you didn't use those points of view because these 2 guys see things differently, and the clashes between their perspectives is one of the pleasures of the story as it unfolds. But don't feel like you have to choose one and stick to it. Choose the point of view based on the story you want to tell, how close you want to be to the protagonist, how many protagonists you have. If I had 7 point of view characters, I could never get away with first person. It would just kill me. It would be such a challenge to come up with 3 different voices for those characters. But I think they're both valid. Just fit it to the story.
I think you had a question?
Yes, when it comes to short stories, what do you think about different types of prose? Like, do you think you prefer sort of a simpler, starker approach to it, or maybe more long and flowing and eloquent? Like, what do you think would be better for that particular type of story?
Again, I think Dave sort of touched on it in that you have to figure out what story you're trying to tell before you determine what style you're telling it in. You know, because different types of prose make, you know, fit different types of stories.
If you're playing the odds, I think there are more editors who are averse to florid, poetic language. I think there's a much larger percentage of editors who want, what's the phrase George Martin's editor uses? Your prose should be a window to the world that you're presenting. It should never give you any impediment. Now that said, George is not a plain writer. He uses a certain amount, I don't want to use the word florid, he uses poetic devices quite frequently, and it works just great. But I think on the whole, his language is clear, and it brings you into the world without making you go to the dictionary every few pages.
And one example, like we've rejected stories that were so beautifully written and so poetic and so lovely, and we didn't have a clue what the writer was trying to tell us. And so, you know, there aren't that many rules, but one of the rules is that you want to keep your reader engaged. You don't want to fight your reader. You don't want your reader to get frustrated, although there are some times when it is good to frustrate the reader. You want to make them work a little bit. But there's a lot of stories that we get where we know somewhere that that author knows exactly what they're trying to say, but they just haven't said it to us. So.
Also, book.
I guess back here.
If it's an emotionally upsetting, an emotionally disturbing novel and it turns you off in a sense because of how upsetting it is, does that have a lesser chance of being accepted and being published?
Oh, I guess it depends. I mean, it's okay to upset and have like a story that's emotionally evokes emotions, because that's good. You want your reader engaged. On the other hand, you don't want to just try to turn people off just for the sake of turning them off, or just because you don't know what else to do. So I'm just going to do something totally off the wall and bizarre or upsetting because I don't know what to do with these characters, and it'll be shocking. And if it doesn't serve the plot or the character, then you know, that's not good. So no, if it's anything no, you know, if it makes me squeamish, I'll be like, ooh, squeamish. But no, I wouldn't just say, oh, that may be uncomfortable, so I'll not publish that book. I did actually reject a book last couple months. There was a rather brutal graphic rape scene. This woman is brutalized for days, and literally the author had a magician come in and just magic away everything, and she was okay in a week. It was all right. And I was like, this is not, you know, you need to handle that responsibly, and it's okay that that's happened to her, but have it at least handled responsibly and realistically, her recovery or what she's going through and how she deals with that on some level. And for you to just say that that's happening to her so that this other character can do something, that I didn't like, because it didn't serve her character and it didn't actually further the plot.
I just wanted to add, excuse me. Generally speaking, I think that you will find it harder to find a market that accepts a harrowing story, a difficult story. But there is a market for it, and there's definitely an audience for it. And if it's worthwhile, you'll find a place to publish it. But you may just have to look a little harder to find that place. Also, book.
Hi. Do you think it's important for a story to have a theme or a unifying idea, or is plot and character enough? And how would you see those three kind of relating and supporting each other?
Well, as far as we're concerned, they all have to relate and support each other. We get a lot of idea stories that are basically, we have a phrase when we're doing our editorial work, we're selecting stories, and Anne Marston taught us to call a story a hate story, H-A-I-T-E. Here's an idea, the end. And we get a lot of those, where everything is so beautifully set up, and it's a really cool idea, and then the author just totally loses steam and just stops the story right dead in its tracks, and we have no idea what happens afterwards. And that's usually, there's a lot of stories where we have to say, and then what happened? And if that's what the editor is saying, then that's what the reader's going to say, and that's not the kind of story we want.
You remember how I said, don't worry too much about all the writing advice and just sit down and write? I still mean that. But if you're interested in story structure at all, I want to recommend a book, Bob McKee's Story. It's primarily about screenwriting, but it applies to all sorts of different writing. One of the truest things that he says is plot is character. If this story could happen to anybody else, you've chosen the wrong character. If this character could make any other choices than happen in this plot, you've chosen the wrong plot. And I think that if you choose the right character and the right plot, your theme's going to emerge. You're not going to, it's not something you have to add. It's something that's going to come naturally out of the reaction between your character and the events that she faces. And book.
When you're writing a story, how do you prevent the plot from escaping you and going in directions that you didn't originally plan on, but it just flowed that way when you was writing?
I got this.
Yeah, you're the writer.
George Martin famously uses the words gardener and architect to describe the two different kinds of author. And they're also known as outliners and pantsers. They run by the seat of their pants. George likes to be a gardener. He likes the story to evolve as it goes along, but he has a basic idea of what's in mind. An awful lot of young, or beginning authors, I should say, think of themselves as unfettered by outline. They're gardeners, they're pantsers, and the story is just going to leap from their forehead like Athena from Zeus. And that's the mistake that so many people make. It's not going to happen that way for you. Yes, it's more romantic to be a gardener. It's a more beautiful idea that this story just evolves naturally. But for most of us, an outline really, really helps. Plot is for many writers, and I'm one of them, plot is the hardest part. That's where you really need to sit down and decide, this is the course of events. Here are the challenges the character is going to face. This is why it's interesting. Here are the low points. There have to be low points. You can't have a character just make the right decisions one after another. That's not a plot, and it's not interesting. You've got to schedule that out somehow. I don't care whether it's a very elaborate outline. It might be one page with 5 points on it. But if you can look at that and see a progression of challenges and an ultimate victory or an interesting defeat, then you're not going to lose track of your story. It's going to be under your control. If right now you think that you're a gardener, kill that thought and become an architect. Your life will be much easier, and you'll have a much better chance, I think, of becoming an author who writes more than a couple of published stories.
In the back.
So I'm almost done my novel, and I've got this monstrosity, and I'm wondering what advice you can give to first-time novelists. What do I do with this? What is the process to submit to publishers? What are you looking for? Like you touched a little on how much you read, so you kind of have to read it in the first couple pages.
Well, first you have to finish it. Like, once you sit down, you get your butt in the chair and the right, as Dave says, then the next thing is to actually finish what it is you're writing, because there are a lot of people out there who edit, and revise, and never actually finish. And then you need to actually do a little research and find who's going to suit you. Do you want to go with try a large press? Do you want to try to find an agent? Do you want to try to self-publish? Do you want to go with a small press? If you're writing shorts, which magazines you're going towards? And find the one that's going to suit you and actually suit your book. So if you have written a horror, don't submit your book to a romance. They're not going to take it. Find the publisher that's actually publishing what it is that you've written as best you can, and follow their guidelines. They're not open for submissions right now. Don't send them something, because they're not going to bother to read it. That's just sort of the basic things. I think Dave can probably talk a bit more about submissions if he wants, but that's how on Spec, don't send Diane stories if they're not open for submissions. Check out their
Don't
website.
send us your novel either.
Don't send them your novel either, but
Having said that, we got a novel a couple of years ago from this fellow whose cover letter basically said, "I know you don't publish novels, but I bet you know somebody who does."
Oh, and don't send out mass emails, and don't do a BCC for 100 publishers and just do a generic thing. And please, if you're sending it out to someone, get the right publisher name in your cover letter. That's always helps. Do a little research, check out the publishers you're looking at, and look at their website. Maybe read some of the things they've published, and get a feel for what it is, and that will help you succeed, I think, in finding someone to suit you.
Okay, so this is a question of opinion. Do you guys generally prefer books that are like really realistic, or books that are like full force fantasy, and if you remove the fantasy from it, then it's basically nothing?
Yes. I'm not sure what you're describing by that second one, but I personally like a wide range of fiction, and I think.
Well, we definitely do as far as short stories are concerned. We don't want to be a one-note magazine. We want to have a wide variety, and that's why I have the editors that I have, because each one of us has our own strengths and our own preferences. And I mean, the joke at On Spec is that we have one male editor, and so he's the one that says to us, "Ladies, that's a guy story. We have to buy it." And he's pretty well always right. So there's things that he sees that we don't see.
Yeah, and I think it also depends. Like if I'm reading a fantasy, I'm going to suspend my beliefs. I know I'm reading a fantasy, right? So okay, everyone has magic. Oh, yeah, you don't need to explain why. I'll buy that. I'm willing to do that because that's the book I'm reading. If you're giving me a hard sci-fi story, then I'm going to expect your science to hold up. And speculation is okay, but your basic underlying science needs to make sense and work. Do we down here?
Can I mention?
Go ahead, Dave.
The more efficient, economical way to get noticed is to get some short fiction published. I know that a lot of people don't want that. They want to write their novel and go out there and sell it immediately, and it happens. But it doesn't happen unless you get noticed somehow. So once you've got that novel written and you're ready to show it to somebody who might like to represent you or buy it, take it to conventions. I mean, you don't want to hand it to somebody, but you want to print up a nice business card. You want to meet these people at conventions, and by these people I mean agents and editors, all sorts of agents and editors. That's the right place to talk to them. And I don't mean a big convention like this. It's seldom that people will interact with you at a large event. But if you go to, say, When Words Collide in Calgary, or Pure Spec in Edmonton, or probably the best place to go if you're selling a fantasy novel is World Fantasy Convention, wherever that is that year, or for fantasy and science fiction, WorldCon. Or if you're writing a horror novel, World Horror Convention. That's where the people who can buy your work will show up. And they expect to be approached. You can talk to them while they're behind a booth, at the bar. Don't follow them into the room, usually. That's a bad idea. But that's what you do. You go to conventions, you meet people. Or if you have a connection who can point you at an agent who's looking for new authors, certain agents will sometimes not so much make an open call, but if you get connected by a friend of a friend or write a good letter of introduction, you can sometimes pick up an agent that way. Every once in a while, if you're doing something else to get noticed, I do a lot of tie-in fiction, an agent will come to you and say, what are your plans? And then the next email is, I've finished another novel, and would you like to look at it? So meet an agent at a convention.
Do you guys have anybody that sits in your office and reads the short stories that are awful and let those authors know that their writing sucks?
Well, like I said, we all read everything in the slush pile. And we're all responsible for writing our own rejection letters. And so there isn't one person. There used to be one person that would actually sit and read everything, and then she would filter out. But then we decided that it was actually kind of embarrassing, because we'd show up at a convention and somebody would come up and say, "Hi, I sent you a story and you rejected it." And I would look at that person and go, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know you. You know, I don't remember your name," because I hadn't even seen that story, and I didn't really want that to happen. I wanted to be able to say that an actual editor on the staff had read all the stories. So that's what we do. But we do send, we don't really say your story sucks. I mean, we'll say something like, well, you know, maybe your character development, development needs a bit of work, or your ending isn't logical. There's a twist there that shouldn't, that it just isn't happening properly. So we're trying to give them some kind of guidance as to what they've done wrong with the story, why it fell off the rails, basically, why we became disengaged with it. 5 minutes? Okay.
Okay. On the subject of agents, do people ever get agents for short fiction, or does something like On Spec, is it strictly out of the slush pile completely?
Some we have received some agented stories. I just don't know how they do it, or why, unless it's a particular author that has already got the agent for their long fiction, and maybe the agent also represents them that way. I don't know.
It's seldom to have an agent talk to you about a short story. It's happened to me once.
There's no money in it for them.
Yeah, that's the thing. And an awful lot of agents will tell you, you take care of your short fiction. It's not worth my time. On the other hand, if you're a big shot, your agent might insist on touching everything just to make sure the contracts are always to his or her satisfaction. How many times have I said book?
I think
Three?
three.
Okay.
All right, I'm actually not looking for publishing work. I'm just kind of writing for the fun of it. You were talking about the gardener versus the architect. For the longest time, I did the gardening style. I just wrote on a whim, and a lot of people seem to like my writing. But I'm now working on a longer short story, and I've got the outline, I've got the development, I've got everything, and I've hit a huge block. The story fits perfectly, but I've lost all enthusiasm for it. Is there anything that I can do to maybe get the spark back?
Go rogue. Always start out as an architect, but never be afraid to suddenly become a gardener for as long as it takes to get back into your story. I should have made that clear. Very few architects are pure architects. Very few gardeners are pure gardeners. But I think most gardeners fail to finish their stories, whereas most architects at least finish the story, and maybe it's not a great story, but the plot did not stop them.